This is this wacky conspiracy theory stuff where people think there's everyone in the US government is clear to this information. Nothing could be further from the truth. If the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, whom I briefed, and the head of Intelligence Joint Staff don't have access, why would a senator or House member who comes and goes every 2 to 6 years have access, right? A president comes every 4 to 8 years. Some have been read in a little bit, some have been told nothing. And the ones who've known the most, like Vice President Cheney and George H.W. Bush, were part of the senior committee keeping it secret. Now we know this, we know who they are, and they are subject to subpoena.
Chris Lehto, welcome to Lehto Files. Welcome to Lehto Files. I am Chris Lehto. I have a very exciting show tonight with Stephen Greer. Dr. Stephen Greer is an American ufologist. He founded the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence and the Disclosure Project, which seeks the disclosure of alleged classified UFO information. He has the next large event, the disclosure event, he says, on 10 June. That'll be 10, 11, 12 June in Washington, D.C. Greer founded the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence in 1990 to create a diplomatic and research-based initiative to contact extraterrestrial civilizations. The group defined CE5, or Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, as human-initiated contact and communication with extraterrestrial life. This is CE5, if you've heard of that. CSETI claims to have over 3,000 confirmed reports of UFO sightings by pilots and over 4,000 of what they describe as landing traces. Very interesting. So extremely excited to have on Dr. Stephen Greer.
With you, a couple corrections. I'm not a ufologist because no such thing exists, number one. I'm an emergency and trauma medical doctor, and I founded the Global Disclosure Movement in the 1990s. It sort of kicked off in 2001 at the National Press Club, which I'm sure many people have seen. I think around 800 million people saw that. We're doing a bigger one this June 12th at the National Press Club. And then there's a conference 2 days before, and we have a number of top secret military witnesses who are coming forward there. And we will be unveiling the Disclosure UFO Intelligence Archive, which is about a 5 terabyte database that we are now providing to the United States government and the investigators who have now pivoted to actually drilling down on the subject officially.
Excellent. Is that the 3,000 pilot sightings that I mentioned and the 4,000 other trace elements?
That summary you read was from the 1990s. That's what we have now is a large multiple of that. As you know, when we first did the Disclosure Project briefings for President Clinton and his CI director, we had about a dozen of these whistleblowers. And then by the late 90s, we had about 100, a little over 100 whistleblowers and military folks. At this point, we have, I think, our master witness list, which is being provided to the investigators for the U.S. Congress and the Pentagon, has about 758 whistleblowers who are TSSCI, top secret special compartmented information, and who have been in various corporate and military positions. So along with that, we have thousands of pages of government documents, some of which have not been declassified, but which we have declassified under a directive stating that these projects have been run illegally, unconstitutionally, and therefore there are no National Security Act provisions that apply to these illegally run projects.
What is your take on the recent NDAA 2023, the law that supposedly protects whistleblowers? Do you think it's providing that protection?
Well, I was very involved with that, frankly, behind the scenes, and getting language in there to protect not just military and government and intelligence, but also corporate. What most people don't understand, the center of gravity on this issue is not in the governments, it is in the corporate sector. The contractors, or WFO, work for others. My uncle, who helped design the lunar module, land on the moon the first time, His company was Northrop Grumman. So companies like Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Skunk Works, Lockheed Martin, Booz Allen Hamilton, MITRE Corporation, some of the Boeing activities, Ford and GM, and a number of others, General Electric, have been the center of gravity on this since the 1940s and 50s. The US government, about 1957 to 60, essentially got decapitated out of operational control over these projects, at least from the point of view of presidential control and congressional oversight. And this is something that we can prove, and I'm announcing on your show, the first external show we've announced this, that we will be initiating a federal RICO lawsuit against these illegal operations in the US government and in the corporate world that have kept these projects run on an illegal and unconstitutional basis for now over 65 years.
The new law, the NDAA 2023,
Mhm.
supposedly it also covers contractors, any
Correct.
contractors that have worked with the government.
Yes, I worked to get that put in there because the people who are writing the law didn't understand this dynamic of what, going back to Eisenhower, the military industrial complex, the operative word industrial, and I might say more operative word fascist, because what happened was the corporate sector began to really call the shots. And even at our top secret bases, like the Dugway Proving Grounds, where we have a top secret witness coming forward now, the corporate research facilities there own 52% of all activities, and the government 48%. That's been done deliberately. So there are a number of complex issues here. So one of them is oversight and rule of law. And when you start talking about the level of embezzlement of funds and the type of criminal activity that has been going on with these projects, it certainly triggers what's known as the RICO, or racketeering, influence, corrupt organization laws that were passed in 1970 against these sort of organized criminal activities.
Oh, that is excellent. So that's a great idea. This is using
Yep.
that law?
Yes. So we are in the process of doing it. Now, the NDAA that was passed, that was just a normal Defense Authorization Act, but it had a provision for folks to be brought into an office at the Pentagon known as AARO, AARO. And that office, of course, has been taking in a number of top secret folks' testimony, and we've been, providing a lot of those. And of course, that is a top secret process that is done in a SCIF. It does not result necessarily in disclosure to the public or to most of the members of Congress, but that information is filtering up to select members of the U.S. Congress and oversight committees that we are involved with. What the problem with it is that it's a gatekeeper function. And I think that the director of the project, Dr. Kirkpatrick, is going to have to be watched very carefully, because we know of folks who have been taken into this facility and who have not been treated well. But also we're concerned that some of their testimony and evidence will be sanitized out of what ends up getting to the members of Congress that have mandated and authorized and funded this investigation at the Pentagon. So we're serving as also as a watchdog function through folks who are involved in the system. I can't mention who those are, to be sure that that office does not end up being another useless dog and pony show, which most U.S. government investigations into this subject have been historically.
You mentioned that in the late 60s, something changed in the government. Can you describe
No, that was the late
what
50s.
actually happened?
No, sir, it was the late 50s.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, the late 50s. Yeah, can you describe that? What happened, or as far as you understand it, obviously?
Well, I understand it quite well. I mean, you have to understand, I've been providing briefings for people like the director of the CIA and other folks since I was a very young doctor in my 30s. I think that the problem with this is that about 1957 to 60, President Dwight Eisenhower, who famously said, "Beware the military industrial complex," had a group, found out that there was a group that was going off of authorized supervision by the president and also by the Congress, and began to engage in unacknowledged special access projects and black projects, but they were so deep black that neither he nor the Congress were being informed about many of their activities. He and Kennedy warned about this, by the way. And of course, it fell on deaf ears, and they were not explicit that it was dealing not solely, but largely with this UFO issue. Because from 1945 until the late 50s, we had acquired extraterrestrial vehicles and were reverse engineering them. And the corporate contractors and the government involvement, which are the sort of what we call now the legacy projects from that era, began to operate without proper oversight because they did not want the information to leak out even from the White House and congressional offices. And while the secrecy could be explained in some regards, the management of it became increasingly illegal and unconstitutional, to such a point now that, from the 1993-92 period when I got involved at this level, we found that the president and senior members of the Congress who were to be informed of these sort of operations were being not only not informed, but actively denied access and, I might add, threatened. So this becomes a very big problem if you're in a alleged constitutional democratic republic such as the United States or a democracy like most of Europe. So, and by the way, this pattern of behavior exists also in the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and other countries. I mean, when I briefed and met with the Minister of Defense of Great Britain, he had the same story to tell, that even though he was head of the MOD and with that MI5 and MI6, he was not given information on this subject. Same thing with the Minister of Defense of Canada and the Minister of Defense of Australia, with whom I met about 10 years ago. So I think that this is a serious systemic problem of illegally run projects. Now, here's a key point. The lower and mid-level whistleblowers who were following orders and working in these highly compartmented operations were not privy to the fact that at the upper levels, it had become illegally run. And they had no idea that that's the case. And so they, even though they signed non-disclosure agreements, we maintained and have maintained this since 1997 from the proof that we have that can be provided in a court of law, that these projects, because they are being run illegally, anyone who signed an NDA is immediately exonerated from it. And the illegal structure of these projects a priori vitiate any legal binding document that anyone would sign. Now, we established this in a letter to the key agencies of the United States government in late 1997 with a 60-day clock on them responding and to the contrary. And we have proof of this. And to this date, we have never gotten a corrective notice saying that our assessment is incorrect. And therefore, the way this letter was worded, that was unless otherwise directed, and this is done in the military quite a bit, a UNOD letter, we would proceed with the assessment that these projects were illegal, and therefore anyone can come forward as a whistleblower, including with documents and material, physical materials from these operations without punity, without the possibility of legal punishment against them. And that it was the foundation of the Disclosure Project, which went public in the late 90s and early 2000s. Now, at this point, we have amassed so much evidence. As I mentioned, we're handing over about a 5 terabyte hard drive. I don't know if people realize how much data that is. That lists all these whistleblowers and every facility, every top secret code name, all the underground SCIFs, the secure compartmented information facilities, all the bases. And by the way, that facilities list will be made fully public on June 12th of this year at the National Press Club in Washington. So it's regretful that you won't be there, but it's what people should be coming to see if they're interested in this subject at all, in a serious way, as opposed to dilettantes and curiosity seekers. But that's the other thing that we're going to announce. We have an attorney, Derek Garcia, who will be announcing a formation of a team of lawyers to institute a civilian lawsuit under the RICO statutes. Look up RICO. And it allows for a civilian group to do this, where we will then proceed to sue these illegal projects within the US government on which we have actionable intelligence, as well as the corporate folks who are doing this, and claim the damages on behalf of our organization, but also the American people. Now, obviously, the same action, if laws like it exist in Europe and the EU and UK, could be used. I have no knowledge of European law in this area. I can tell you, speak to the US law on it, and we have been advised. Now, I have known since the late 1990s that a RICO action like this could be issued. We had just not found any attorneys willing to take it on. Now we have. So I think that this is a very huge development, by the way. And also what this legal team will do will protect any whistleblowers, anyone listening to your show who have been involved in these projects, who would like to come forward. We not only now have the protections enshrined in the law that we, just referred to, the 2022 law that was passed right before Christmas, allowing a pathway for these witnesses to come forward legally, even if they've signed NDAs. But our position is that their NDAs are vitiated anyway, because we can now prove that the underlying programs are themselves criminal. Now, I will tell you, senior Pentagon and congressional officials and White House military office officials have told me that they concur with that assessment. So this is a very big story breaking. So at this point, we need to move with all due speed to bring these people forward. So if there are any people listening, we are not only going to protect them through the law that was passed in December, but we will have a team of lawyers who will defend them if, in them coming forward publicly, the legality of their testimony is challenged, because we will absolutely be able to prove in a court of law that those non-disclosure agreements they signed are absolutely not worth toilet paper. They were signed on behalf of an organization and a compartmented level of intelligence and military operations that were themselves being run illegally. Now, let me give you one example, so this isn't just abstract for people. Back in the years when we were putting together these materials for the president and the CIA director, and eventually I, met with Lawrence Rockefeller at the Rockefeller Ranch out in the Tetons, I had learned that the president at the time, Bill Clinton, had made inquiries into this. And I was told prior to my briefing his CIA director, R. James Woolsey, that in fact, he and the CIA director and one of his Department of Justice associates, Webster Hubbell, had made inquiries into this matter and had been denied access. I later learned that he was actually not so subtly threatened by former CIA director and former President George H.W. Bush. I have just received a written statement and testimony from someone who spoke to President Clinton about this after he left office, affirming what I just told you. And this will also be disclosed at the National Press Club. Now, on top of this, you have people like Admiral Tom Wilson, whom we briefed back in the 90s, 1997. Of course, a memo from Dr. Eric Davis leaked out some years ago about this. I believe it came from Edgar Mitchell's archives after he died, because I had brought the astronaut Edgar Mitchell to the meeting so he could learn about this subject along with the Admiral. But this was a stand-up briefing which I conducted at the Pentagon for Admiral Wilson, who at the time was J2. He was the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, what is said in that memo that leaked is true. The meeting took place and the Admiral was threatened with demotion, but he was threatened with more than that. And I will tell you that if you have an organization that denies access to, and we can prove this in a court of law, senior members of the Senate Intelligence Committee, House Government Reform and Oversight Committee, the President of the United States, the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, General Patrick Hughes, whom I personally briefed, the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Tom Wilson, et cetera, ad nauseum. And these people certainly had a need to know. And they were not only denied access, but in many cases threatened. This is a prima facie case of unconstitutional and illegal conduct by a group that is unchecked with unchecked power. So I think that, this is a very serious stuff here, because far from being the giggle factor of little green or gray men or whatever rubbish is the occupies what you called ufology. We're in a serious crisis, not only because this has upended the whole idea of the rule of law and freedom and the Constitution in our country and yours. I would also argue that the sequestration and suppression of these technologies. We have a film coming out June 6th, 6 days before the National Press Club event, that is called The Lost Century and How to Reclaim It. And it's an expose of the confiscation of these top secret technologies for 100 years by corrupt interests and by the misuse and abuse of government power, including the US patent law and other activities. And what does that mean? It means you and I are all burning oil and gas and coal when for 100 years we have not needed it. We are still using airplanes when we've had electrogravitic man-made UFOs since 1954. So we're living, our civilization, I hate to inform folks, is a faint, dying fragment of what it could and should be. And so this process of disclosing this has ramifications not just for the national security and rule of law, but for the environment and for all of humanity. So I think that the even worse than that, and I think the gravest threat facing the world right now, which no one's talking about besides China and Iran and Russia and all the usual geopolitical discussion, is that this same clandestine and illegal group have developed very advanced, what are called scalar or longitudinal weapons that are targeting these extraterrestrial vehicles and can, because of quantum entanglement, meaning that they can reach way out in space without limits of the speed of light. I won't get too much into this. You have to look up what quantum entanglement is and what scalar waves are. But this poses a very serious threat to the entire world's security, because you have a group of people who are, like Dr. Strangelove in that movie from the 60s with that weird mad scientist writing the nuclear bomb down to the earth, doing things without the knowledge, I can say personally for a fact, of the president and the Congress or the United Nations or the European Parliament or anyone else, that is really presenting an existential threat to all life on earth because of this reckless behavior. So all of this needs to be exposed and reined in, and it should have happened. Well, first of all, it should have never gotten this far. When I was at Senator Barry Goldwater's home, he ran for president in 1964, before probably most people listening were alive. But when I was at his home, and John McCain, Senator McCain took his seat in Arizona, and he just flat out said to me, he said it was a goddamn mistake then and a goddamn mistake now that this was ever kept secret by the military. So one of the big mistakes that happened in the 40s is that this entire subject became the province of the military and industrial complex rather than diplomats and scientists and more transparent programs. So I think that a Frankenstein got created in the 40s and 50s, and it walked up off the table, and it's been lurking around the world ever since. So the question is, how do we, the people and our government, get this back under some kind of supervision and control so that would benefit humanity and do so in a rather expeditious fashion? Good news is a very significant number of people in the US Congress now understand this is a problem, and they are moving quickly to try to investigate and get to the bottom of it. And we're assisting with that to the extent we can as an unfunded volunteer nonprofit group. I mean, we're not for profit, but we work with volunteers. We have very few staff, but we have so many dedicated people. And I have to say, I was on a wonderful show, a man I greatly admire, a Navy SEAL named Sean Ryan, a couple of months ago. And we've had such a great response from the military community of whistleblowers coming forward who know this is a problem and have courageously stepping forward. I think we'll have 4 or 5 of these whistleblowers that are new at the National Press Club event on June 12th and at our 2-day conference in Washington, D.C. the 2 days before on June 10th and 11th. And we'll provide a link for you guys if you want to come personally, or you can see it by streaming. It'll be on the streaming also, so you can see it remotely. And I think that the reason we're wanting to do this, and I've been asked to do it by some leaders in Washington, is because the people who are in Congress need the support of the people to pursue this, because the subject has such a patina of kookiness and weirdness and low esteem in the media that it's a bit of a PR problem for these members of Congress and for the White House. So we need to make it quite clear this is a serious matter and there are serious people involved, and there are bona fide military folks coming forward willing to step up to the plate and speak the truth, not just in the skiff at the Pentagon, but to the American people.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, it sounds amazing. Thinking back to, I'm sorry. Yeah, that was like a 15-minute answer.
Yeah, sorry.
I'll cut this out. I got to ask some questions, man. Okay, excellent. Very excited about all that stuff. So
Okay.
let's, okay, Dr. Greer. I mean, that all sounds very amazing. Let me ask a few questions here.
Mm-hmm.
You're a controversial figure, I'll just say that in ufology or whatever you consider it. But you have a huge following and these amazing stories and hundreds of members. I guess, how did you come about this path? Can you tell us your path to becoming one of these most recognized figures? You mentioned Bill Clinton. You mentioned all these White Houses. It's almost overwhelming, the amount of things that you've done. How did this path start for you?
Well, it was quite accidental. I had an interest in this since I was a child. Of course, I mentioned that my mom's oldest brother worked on the lunar module and had an interest. And then when I was quite young, I had a sighting, very clear daylight one. And when I was 8 or 9, it must have been 1963 or 4, of one of these objects, seamless, and it didn't fly in and out like a plane or a man-made UFO, the so-called ARVs, alien reproduction vehicles. It just materialized, was there, boom, left. And my twin sister and some boys in the neighborhood and I saw it. So it ignited a lifelong fascination on my part. So I started looking into it even as a child. And then as I got older, I became quite aware of the significance of this and had a very interesting close encounter of the fifth kind, as we call it, contact experience, when I was hiking up in the mountains of the Blue Ridge Mountains here in the United States, in North Carolina. And what I learned from that is that these civilizations were, number one, not at all hostile, but number two, very concerned with our hostility, particularly our weapons and the damage to the biosphere. And number three, that a time was approaching, where this issue needed to be dealt with openly and get resolved in a peaceful way, where humans would begin to interact with these civilizations in a halfway rational fashion, as opposed to down the barrel of a gun or a laser weapon or a scalar weapon. So that sort of percolated in my awareness for a number of years. And as a young doctor in 1990, I started this CE5 contact endeavor. And there's an app that trains people on how to do this and involves not only the ability to do remote viewing and contact and what have you. And the CE5 contact app, we just came out with a 2.0 version of it and fixed some of the glitches that were in it. But that is a training module for people to be these sort of interface ambassadors between humans and these civilizations. So in 1992, I was away from my hospital. I took a group down to Florida on the Gulf Coast near Pensacola. And we were doing the CE5 contact protocols, and 4 of these ET craft popped into the sky. Now, one of them got photographed and was on the front page of the Pensacola paper the next day. And then the word leaked out. Next thing you know, I have people, friendly and unfriendly, from the government approaching me. The unfriendlies were headed up by a General Albert Stubblebine III, who a couple months later offered me $2 billion to be quiet and not do what we're doing. The others were folks who were dispatched a few months later after Bill Clinton had been elected. and said that the president was very interested in this subject and needed to get some information. So this sort of, now you have to visualize this. I'm working full time as an emergency doctor at a very busy emergency department with 4 young children and what have you. And I'm flying up from North Carolina, where my hospital was, to DC in my spare time, such as it was, to provide this information for free, just because I felt as a citizen, if they needed to know this. But once I discovered in 1993 and 4 that there was, in fact, an illegal operation, I didn't know this before 1994, and that it had become so well developed that it was able to not only threaten, but leave out of the picture substantially the president and members of Congress. I then started really drilling down on this with the early days of what people call the Disclosure Project and the Disclosure Movement, but it was called Project Starlight. And Project Starlight was the code name that a group of us called the effort to brief members of not only the Congress and the White House, but also the United Nations and other countries, to see if they would take action on this. Well,
And
of
would
course.
will they take action? Didn't seem like it, I guess.
Well, it's a process. You remember governments move at the speed of molasses in winter in Vermont on something like this, because the CIA and other entities have done a very good job of ridiculing the subject. I have a CIA document where in the 1950s where they talk about engaging Disney studios to make cartoons about this issue. And so the psychological warfare operations around this that got stood up in the 40s and 50s are substantial, which is why, it's just sort of the butt of jokes, and serious journalists and scientists won't take it seriously.
How do you see through the misinformation? When you get all these hundreds of witnesses, I guess, how do you know if there's misinformation? Or how do you vet your witnesses?
Well, first we vet them and we ask them to provide their credentials. Then we do corroboration. So in other words, if I had one person surface who had tactically been involved in a human abduction squad simulating alien abductions, I would have discounted it. But after I had a dozen of them come forward and then discovered there's a CIA document describing this that Jacques Vallée has, and had an Air Force Office of Special Investigations guy who is a professional counterintelligence person admit to it, and et cetera and so on.
Is that Richard Doty or an additional?
Well, Richard Doty, but then Jacques Vallée is in possession of a 1985 document, which he admitted in one of his books in '92, that states that the CIA was staging for its psychological warfare value abductions in Argentina and Brazil in South America. It flat out states that. Now we're trying to get that document released, but my point here is, if you were to take one data point, you'd have to just put it on a side shelf. But once you get multiple points of corroboration, now let me give you another example. I have known since the early and mid 90s that there is a very hardcore rogue group of these clandestine operations using classified cover and man-made UFOs, what are called ARVs, or alien reproduction vehicles, to run drugs and weapons. Well, is that a myth or is it true? Well, it is true. And at the National Press Club on June 12th, Marine, who has also named his 5 buddies who were in his platoon, who came across an operation like this in 2009, will testify. His testimony has already been provided through the top secret channels. And you will see the drawing of the craft. It was 300 feet in diameter. We have another man who was attached to the CIA involved with this, who has reached out to us. I'm not sure he'll come forward publicly, but he will come through the classified process. So if you just have one person that's secondhand, but if you get a number of direct, and remember the New York Times, here's the hypocrisy of the media. And by the way, of also ufology. If you have 1 or 2 people, one person who makes an outrageous statement like that, you discount it. If you get 3, 4, 5 points of corroboration, then you do a report on it. But see, there's a double standard for the UFO subject. And that's the main problem with the media because of their bias against it. But at a certain point, the facts and the evidence and the whistleblowers speak for themselves. And so I think that ultimately a private organization like ours does not have standing to prosecute criminally, nor do we have the funds that the US government or the British or European governments have to investigate and penetrate these operations. The best we can do is collect people who are courageous enough and patriotic enough to come forward, protect them, provide them a pathway to share their information, both through the government and public channels, which is what we're doing, and ultimately do the best we can. Now, obviously, if we had, millions of dollars in funding and, dozens of investigators, I'm sure we could do a better job. But we're doing this with all volunteers. So that's the state of the art right now. And that's the best you can do until somebody actually begins to take this seriously.
Thanks. I wanted to ask this question. I thought it was interesting from one of my patrons. And so he wanted to ask for any specifics if you could possibly give regarding Colonel Alexander and his sidekicks using tech to scare the Shermans off Skinwalker Ranch. That was so Bigelow could purchase it. And he was quite interested in that.
Well, look, if anyone who drills down on this subject and gets a little bit deep into it, will realize that there are electromagnetic weapons and technologies that were developed in the late 40s and 50s that can simulate almost anything. And we're not talking holograms. So what often has happened is that you have the real extraterrestrial phenomenon, and then you also have something called interdimensional phenomenon that's not extraterrestrial. And then you have a covert group that have these sort of electromagnetic technologies that can simulate the other two, both extraterrestrial and interdimensional. So everyone is always fighting the last war. They're thinking that, most people think that the state of the art of technology is the thermonuclear weapon and some bioweapons and things like this. But when you look at trillions of dollars going into clandestine projects over the last 75 years, dealing specifically with this very, some would call esoteric, but very detailed area of physics known as transdimensional physics, very high voltage electromagnetic systems, you get some substantial breakthroughs. So as you know, if you've read the disclosure book, we had a witness who was at a Canadian air base in 1953, where they were able to, this is rather banal, but they were able to teleport from one side of the base to the other, an ashtray, and back and forth under controlled circumstances. And we have multiple people who've been in facilities, corporate and governmental, where those sort of technologies exist. Now, there's a funny name for this at the CIA. It's WSFM, Weird Science and Frickin' Magic. My uncle's old company just called it pure fucking magic, excuse my language, PFM. But those sort of technologies can be deployed, as they were at the Skinwalker Ranch, to scare someone off or create all kinds of phenomenon. And then the question becomes, what part of the phenomenon that was going on there was, let's call it, endogenous or indigenous or naturally occurring there? And then what part of it ended up being changed by these sort of very, very advanced weapon systems and very advanced electromagnetic systems? And so this is generally called stagecraft, where you can stage a number of things. For example, a guy who had some scary alien, quote unquote, encounter, Stan Ruminek in Denver some years ago. I was at his home with an investigator, and he showed me the videotape that the Disney bought from him and black shelved and wouldn't let the public see. But it was one of these man-made aliens, robotically looking, but moving rather stiffly. It looked like what most people call a gray, that came in through a canister of some type. He passes out some chemical knockout agent. The camera falls over. The day later, he gets a call from a synthesized voice that sounded British, a woman's voice, and he played it for me. And it was someone in the military who must have known his father, who was Air Force, saying, "Stan, that is one of the fake ones." Now, Stan Ruminek did not know what that meant. And the director for MUFON for Colorado was with us, and he didn't know. I said, oh, yeah, that's what these are. What most people call mutilations and abductions are staged event by a clandestine human group using these kinds of technologies. And can that be done? Absolutely. Has it been done? Yes. When did it start? Late 1950s, early 1960s. And this is why you have to deconstruct the entire database of
Why
so-called
the
alien
mutilation?
encounters.
I'm sorry, but why the mutilations? What is the point of that?
Psychological warfare. In other words, what's required as the guy who invented the rocket told Carol Rosin, his chief spokesperson for the last 5 years, was like, we have to create the specter of something out there to unite the world to fight against. That's what Ronald Reagan said at the UN. And how do you do that? Well, you have to engage in these propaganda, psychological warfare events that are very realistic and a classic false flag sort of operations. And unfortunately, in this area of what you're calling ufology, I don't know really what that means, there's not a lot of effort to try to look at these sort of things dispassionately and go to where the source evidence is. So what I tell people is, have there been actual ET encounters? Yes. Have there been staged fake alien encounters? Yes. Have there been staged other events that are these electromagnetic sort of warfare systems at places like Skinwalker and the ranch there in outside Sedona, right? That famous place that's become a black site now, et cetera, and so on. They have. So, but you have to go to enough methods and sources and people who worked on these systems to piece that together. Now, when I started out on this, I'll admit, I thought everything that went bump in the night was alien, and it was all just exactly what everyone thinks it is. I did. I was that kind of a person because a little knowledge is a dangerous thing here. But what I think we have to admit is that it's a very complex issue, and there are some very, very powerful interests who would benefit from uniting the world around a sort of totalitarian junta of militarists against an alien threat. Now, the question is, if there is a threat from outer space, I'm quite sure they would have declared that to be the case before we almost reached parity with them technologically and had studied and reverse engineered all their objects. So then what is actually going on? Well, I think this has to do with control. I think it has to do with the staging of a lot of UFO events that are actually fake for their psychological warfare purpose, quote unquote. I'm pulling that directly from the document Jacques Vallée has and directly from the 1953 CIA Psychological Review Board document signed by the CIA Director at the time, Smith. And CIA Director Smith said the UFO subject has value for its psychological warfare uses. So I think that we have to be incredibly skeptical about things that try to position this as a national security threat or as some alien invasion scenario, because this is how we stumble into World War III. On the other hand, I totally agree with people when they say UFOs are a threat to the national security. But I say, yes, but which UFO? The ones from another star system or the ones from the Lockheed Skunk Works? Most people have not begun to ask that question yet. And that's one of the things we're going to be presenting at the National Press Club is the evidence for. We're going to have a man who worked with some Raytheon guys with one of these silent anti-grav triangles come forward. He's given his testimony. He's going into the skiff. It'll be shown to the whole world. So the question becomes, when there are those many people coming forward who have had the same story and experience and evidence, we need to start listening to these military heroes and contractors who have the courage to step forward. And I'd like to ask people who are listening now, if you are, or if you know someone who would fall into that category, they should contact us at our website immediately, because this is a very rapidly evolving situation, at least here in the United States with the Congress and the White House.
Excellent. The link is in the description, so recommend you guys check that out.
Yep.
So what is your assessment, Dr. Greer, of the government's efforts? You mentioned that there's so many corrupt areas. We have so many areas of government ignorance where there could be total pockets of information, maybe not even in the government, like you're suggesting earlier.
Hmm.
They're in actually these contractor, you
Right.
know, civilian elements, like offshore accounts, essentially, is kind of how I envision it. These are like offshore knowledge accounts of these UFO things, so they can't be touched. So, do you have any hope of the government's efforts
Oh,
declassifying?
yes. Yes, I do. Because, and I have to be careful what I'm saying here. For about 16 months, I've been working with a team in Washington that have been ordered to investigate this. I have given them the advanced version of this intelligence archive I'm referring to, including the code names, the locations, the gates, the entry areas of the bases and the corporate facilities working on this. They have gotten into some of them. They now know this is true. And that has filtered up some of the information, not all of it, to the senior people in the US Congress. So absolutely, yes, that there is very serious forward momentum. But now the reason we have to be patient here, and I've been 30 years patient. So welcome to the party, those of you arriving in the last couple of years. But the reason you have to be, and this is where there's a member of Congress I don't want to name that I've been meeting with, who's in the House, not the Senate, who was convinced that his brethren who had TSSCI clearances looking into this were hiding all this detail from him and his other colleagues. And I said, no, sir. No, sir. They're not read in. They're not briefed. The president can't disclose what he doesn't have access to. The chairman of the Senate Intelligence or Armed Services can't disclose what they don't have access to. And so, this is this wacky conspiracy theory stuff where people think there's everyone in the US government is clear to this information. Nothing could be further from the truth. If the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, whom I briefed, and the head of Intelligence Joint Staff don't have access, why would a senator or House member who comes and goes every 2 to 6 years have access, right? A president comes every 4 to 8 years. Some have been read in a little bit, some have been told nothing. And the ones who've known the most, like Vice President Cheney and George H.W. Bush, were part of the senior committee keeping it secret. Now we know this, we know who they are, and they are subject to subpoena. Well, certainly not the ones who passed away. But I think that this is a real problem because, again, there's this sort of like hyperventilating assumption that just because you're the chairman of a key committee in the House or the Senate, that you are, as part of the Gang of Eight, as they called, the senior, read in and briefed on this. But having met with these folks, I know for a fact they're not. And so they're starting at zero. And so we have to be patient. It's a very big learning curve just what I've shared on this podcast, you can imagine, it's a very small tip of an iceberg of what we're providing. To get your mind around that and also not have the hell scared out of you and shut down the process is a balancing act for me and the people I'm working with. But I will say that I am very optimistic that there are now people where they know enough that the game is up. And there are people in the contracting world and the military world who know it. And on the end of the military, there are, let's call them the white hats, the people in the legal constitutional government who are not being told about this, who are fed up, I'm quoting, and who are moving apace to get to the bottom of this. So there is a lot going on behind the scenes. What we want to do with this event on June 10th, 11th, and 12th, and the National Press Club event in particular on the 12th, is to stimulate the public as well as our politicians to advance the pace of this more quickly. And because politics being what it is, these politicians need to hear from their constituents. Everyone listening in the United States and even across the world need to contact the members of Congress and the Senate and the White House and say, this evidence is serious. It needs to be pursued in the interest of world peace and national security very quickly. And that 75 years of this kind of a criminal enterprise is, quite frankly, enough. So I think that's what the public needs to do, because as one person or a small organization like we have here, the best I can do is provide the best evidence we can get and a pathway for whistleblowers who are listening to come forward, and then encourage the public to actually write to and be an activist for a moment and say, this is something we're concerned about. Please act on our behalf to get to the bottom of this and fix these problems. If for no other reason, think of the payday, the sort of, let's call it the payday on the trillions of dollars that have been spent on these clandestine operations over 75 years. If we were to come out simply with an energy device that would sit on your table there that would run your house from the quantum vacuum and 0-point energy field with no pollution and zero energy costs, it literally is free energy. And those systems exist. So getting to the bottom of this, that would result in, within 10 to 20 years, the ending of pollution and poverty on the planet. So even if you don't care about the alien issue and ufology, most people certainly should care. I mean, I have 4 children and now we have 12 grandchildren. My grandchildren are now older than my children were when I started on this wild ride. But I think that we have to look at this and say, what are the prevailing interests of the average everyday people on this, and it's very significant, but we need to help explain that. We also, though, have to explain it to the members of Congress and to the White House and the members of the British Parliament and the Prime Minister there and what have you. And we are reaching out to folks across the pond and in Canada and Australia. But certainly the center of what we're doing is here in the United States. And when I've spoken to senior folks in these other countries, what they say is, we're going to stay on the sidelines till the U.S. does something, because the U.S. is the 800-pound gorilla economically, militarily, et cetera, and so on. So, certainly our main operations are here, but there are very key operations in Europe, in the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, and elsewhere. And as you will hear, we have a man coming forward about the massive Raytheon-built array at the South Pole that is both a reconnaissance and a weapons system, using neutrino light systems that goes out into space. And he will be presenting that evidence along with a physicist describing the scalar technologies and how they operate.
That'll be on the disclosure event?
Yes, that'll be at the 2-day conference. The problem with the National Press Club event, to be honest, the 2-day event will be 0.01% of what's in our archive. The National Press Club event is 2 hours out of 16 hours of presentations over those 2 days. So it's a distillation of a distillation of a distillation of a distillation. And that's the best you can do in the real world, because no one's going to sit at the National Press Club for a 12-hour press conference briefing. So what people need to do is jump on the 2-day conference also.
Okay. And so,
or come in person. I mean, if you're can come. I mean, it's not that hard to come. We still have, I think there's still some room at the host hotel, the Marriott there near the White House.
That would be amazing. Yeah. We have our launch event, the NFC. We're launching our NFT project, UAPeez Society, actually, to raise money for camera systems, Sky 360 camera systems. But I know you're busy, Dr. Greer. So just one last question, I guess.
Sure.
From Dr. Kirkpatrick's, I don't think it was a hearing really with Kirsten Gillibrand. It was more of just a kind of like an interview or a meeting.
It was a briefing.
Yeah, a briefing. So from that, basically, it seems like there's orbs all around. There's these orbs from, it sounded like 1 to 4 meters. They're metallic. They can go stationary up to Mach 2, and we see them all around the world. At the same time, you've been trained as transcendental meditation, right? You are at least very expert.
Before I was a doctor, I went around teaching meditation and doing all that fun stuff. Yeah.
Exactly. So, and I think that goes into the CE5 protocols. And I've kind of found the same thing. I talked to Leslie Kane, and she was she investigated UFOs for decades, and now she's into surviving death and consciousness. So there's some sort of potential link there between consciousness. So I guess, is that all related? Are these orbs somehow related to the CE5 events? Because I've been, people in my Discord have been trying to get me to do a CE5 event, and I,
Mhm.
unfortunately haven't done an official one. I've gone out there and practiced something, but I haven't done it fully.
Well, look, the whole training program for that is anyone who has a phone can get it. It's called CE5 Contact. And it's an entire educational program, very, very inexpensive, and people can do it. What I would say, two things. There are these spheres and orbs. Some are man-made, some are interstellar. So, and again, here's the problem. Is it real or is it Memorex, like the old commercial about the Memorex tapes? Every time there's some part of this phenomenon that happens, I say this as a medical doctor, you need to have in your differential diagnosis three things: extraterrestrial, man-made, or neither, which would be something from another dimension, but not interstellar. And the issue here becomes anything that is interstellar or even transdimensional, interdimensional, has the ability to interface in the quantum entangled aspect of consciousness and thought, because communication systems and everything else that are used by something going across 1,000,000 light years of space, or 2,000,000 or 3 from the Andromeda galaxy to here, they're not using what you and I are using at the speed of light. It'd take 2.5 million years each direction for a signal. It's 5 million years. So we know that they're using both technologies and the conscious field, what's called the consciousness field, for this, which brings you to this whole discussion that I've had with Dr. Russell Targ and others who were with the CIA remote viewing program about the entangled universe and how the space-time matter is fully integrated into the conscious field. And this was my first specialty. The reason I began to have these CE5 contact experiences when I was a young man, 18 years old, is because I was doing that. And I stumbled across this sort of almost like cosmic Rosetta Stone of how these civilizations are using technologies they have, but that can interface with sort of very intensely coherent, directed thought once you're in a quiet state of consciousness that escapes locality. In other words, escapes the boundary of the space and time you're in. And so this is where, Edgar Mitchell, the astronaut Mitchell, who started the Noetic Sciences Institute, to whom I gave a briefing back years ago to their board, really enjoyed this whole idea of how do you break out of linear space-time? Well, there's the physics of it, quantum entanglement, which includes technological, but there's also the consciousness field. And that's why people who study one quickly find that there's an aspect of the phenomenon that has to do with consciousness, thought, non-locality, the plasticity and flexibility of space-time, time travel, remote viewing into the future. These are all things that to the mainstream public sound wacky. And a lot of the kick the tires ufologists hate that I talk about this. But if you're actually dealing with an extraterrestrial vehicle and occupants, you're not dealing with people using radio frequencies like you and I are talking on that were developed in 1844. So I think that we have to begin to look at this in an humble way as humans who are just barely stepping out of the jungle in terms of technology, but also our entire paradigm. And so I liken the cosmos to this quantum conscious hologram that's awake, but where every point in space and time, and this is what Ben Rich at the Lockheed Skunk Works said, is connected to every other point in space and time. But so what does that mean, though? It means that if you understand your own consciousness and your own field of consciousness, you can go into a meditative state and see and interact with remote and invite them and see if something happens. So this sort of interactive, what's called a close encounter of the fifth kind, is when humans actively invite contact as opposed to it being an accidental sighting or what have you. And it's sort of an experiment globally. We now have millions of people doing it, frankly. And it's to see to what extent that can move things forward through what had been termed the Maharishi effect, where when enough people are in a certain coherent state of consciousness, it can shift things very positively towards peace and orderliness and a good outcome. So that's a big part. In fact, that's the originating project. And as I said, the entire disclosure project and my involvement with these folks in the government was an accidental event as a result of a major CE5 that happened in 1992 on a beach in Florida. I never, ever thought I would be doing what I'm doing now, but here we sit.
Well, excellent, Dr. Greer. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. And one last call. Anyone who is a military witness or a military or government contractor who has dealt with this issue, please contact us, and we will keep your information very confidential, and it will only be disclosed if you want it to be to the key people who are the good guys trying to get to the bottom of this in Washington. If you're brave, like the few guys that are coming forward at the National Press Club, you'd be welcome to come forward publicly as well. I think the more people, men and women, who have the courage or their convictions to come forward publicly, the better. And I think that it just is important that now that the law is in place to protect people from their non-disclosure agreement penalties, which, as I mentioned, I don't think are valid agreements at all, but to the extent that you believe they are, at least now there's a law that explicitly protects you. So please contact us if you are that sort of person.
Well, excellent. Yes, please speak out. I know it's difficult, obviously, to publish online. You know, you always get negative comments. That's just the way of the world, but it is important, like you mentioned.
No, these folks, if they approach us, nothing they're giving us is published online unless they want to come forward. Less than 10% of everyone we've identified who is a witness or whistleblower has agreed to be publicly identified. The other 90+%, nobody knows who they are.
Okay, excellent. Well, good luck on.
Thank you. Appreciate your help. Appreciate your help getting the word out. Thank you.
Holy shit balls. That's pretty much all I can say after editing that. You know, he talks amazingly fast, Dr. Stephen Greer, and he is an interesting guy. I know a majority of you probably don't trust him, but I would say I base people on their words and their actions. And the great part about this is we'll either know after June 12th or we won't, right? This article posted yesterday, 24 May 2023, about the disclosure event. Very exciting. I think the more witnesses we can get to come out, the better. You know, I've heard so many hundreds of accounts, maybe thousands. It just seems like, I know he's a very controversial figure, but his arguments are possible and testable, right? It could be possible. And you could say, well, nothing ever comes out of it. But if you look, a lot of things are coming out or potentially coming out. We still haven't seen anything, right? We're still promises of the disclosure project. So, man, either way, it's going to be exciting. I don't know how you can't watch it. And the guy he is a figure. Like I say, I don't have sponsors, but really, guys, please just give it a chance, one shot. This is the white paper, okay? UAP Society. This is the project. You can just read through here. This is actually the white paper. It shows how we're going to build Sky 360 systems basically next month. We're going to start building them. I want to put 2 in Hessdalen, 2 in Mount Wilson Ranch, and 2 here in Portugal. There's been a lot of sightings here in Portugal. We'll need to put out at least 3 more sites. So it's happening fast, happening rapidly. So check it out. Give it a shot. And just read it. If you don't like it, that's fine. It's new. It looks weird. It looks funny. But I would ask you guys, just give it a chance. Just read through the white paper. And then if you don't like it, then you can say at least you checked it out. Thanks for listening. And thank you for being here either way. It really does help the channel. Please like and subscribe. If you want to help more, you can join like these other patrons. Go to patreon.com/Chris Lehto. Get backstage access. I just gave free NFTs to all of these people as an offer. Thanks for being here. Let's try and get to the bottom of this. I think we have a chance. I don't know. We'll see. Peace.